The morning after the auction, General Xiao Yuren did not look at his new slave's face. He looked at the hands. That was his habit. Hands told you what a person had done with their life. Calluses spoke of labor, ink stains of learning, tremors of fear. He had built his entire career on reading men correctly in the first 8 seconds of meeting them. On the battlefield, that skill was the difference between a general and a corpse. The slave's hands were steady, ink stained on the right. The left had a scar across the knuckle, old, clean, the kind left by a blade held correctly and not corrected in time. Not a soldier's scar. A student's. He had bought the man because he stood still when every other captive in that auction pen flinched. The Imperial Supply Officer had been moving down the line with his cane, tapping shoulders, grading men like livestock. Every man flinched. Every man dropped his eyes. This one looked at the wall behind the officer's head and did not move. Educated hands. No fear response. Doesn't react to casual authority. Useful for records work. That was all he had thought. Now he stood in the entrance of his command tent in the gray northern dawn, and the man was kneeling in the center of the floor with perfect posture. Not the posture of a slave, not the compressed, self-erasing submission he had seen from every other captive his army had processed. This was the posture of a man performing stillness. A man who had learned, somewhere along the way, to wear invisibility like armor. Yuren looked at his face for the first time. High bones. Composed mouth. Eyes that were currently fixed on the floor but held, even in that downcast position, a quality he could not name. Not defiance. Something older than defiance. The residue of someone who had once looked at the world from a very different height and had not entirely forgotten it. He filed this away. Said nothing. This is how it begins. Not with desire. With a general noticing something he cannot explain and choosing, for the first time in his career, not to investigate it. Chapter 1. The General and the Ghost. The Northern Camp, Week 1. The Northern Iron Army moved like a living thing. 100,000 soldiers breathing in the cold border air, drilling, eating, maintaining, dying in accidents and skirmishes at a rate Yuren tracked in his weekly reports with the same precision he applied to everything else. He had commanded this force for 6 years. He knew the name of every senior officer, the supply needs of every unit, the morale pressure points that could break a battalion if ignored for too long. He did not permit himself to feel anything about any of it. Feeling slowed you. Feeling made you hesitate at the wrong moment. The slave, whose name was listed in the auction manifest as Luo, was assigned to records, correspondence, and evening briefings. He was given a sleeping pallet in the records annex off the main command tent, a set of plain robes, and access to the camp's communal meals. He received no other instruction. The general did not explain things to slaves. Luo did not require explanation. By the 3rd day he had reorganized the filing system for border supply correspondence, unprompted, without disrupting any active files. Yuren noticed the reorganization, identified it as an improvement, and said nothing about it. By the 5th day Luo had identified a discrepancy in the Eastern Patrol logs, a unit reporting in twice from the same position due to a recording error that would have eventually created a false sense of border security in that quadrant. He left a notation on the relevant file in small, precise script. He did not sign it. Yuren read the notation, looked at the handwriting, set the file down. He sent a correction to the Eastern Patrol. He did not mention it to Luo. Free the scroll. He returned to his tent on the 14th night of the 3rd week later than intended, delayed by a supply dispute with the Southern Quartermaster that had required his direct intervention to prevent it becoming a disciplinary incident. He was tired. He was hungry. He wanted the quiet of his tent and the particular dark that came after a long day of managing men who required constant managing. He got 3 steps inside before he saw Luo. The man was sitting cross-legged on the floor near the brazier, not at the records table, not at his appointed workspace, but on the floor with the posture of someone entirely absorbed in what he was reading. Across his lap was a scroll. Yellowed. Carefully unrolled. Old enough that Yuren recognized its provenance from 4 feet away. Yen military formation script. 30 years old. From the Northern Campaign archives. Yuren stood very still. Luo registered his presence after a moment. some shift in the air, the absence of the expected sounds of an empty tent, and looked up. His expression did not change. He looked at the general with the same composed attention he brought to everything, and he did not immediately close the scroll or explain himself or apologize. That, more than anything else, was what held Urin in place. A guilty man closes the scroll. "Who are you?" Urin said. Not a question. A general's version of one, the statement that precedes an answer whether or not the answer is volunteered. Luo looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at the scroll. Closed it with unhurried hands, the deliberate care of someone who had handled old documents before and knew how to do it without damage. "A slave," he said. "Who made the mistake of reading?" Urin stepped inside. The tent flap fell behind him. He crossed the space between them and crouched, took the scroll from Luo's hands without resistance, and looked at the title. Northern Yen Formation Doctrine, Campaign Season, Year of the Iron Dog. His own army had recovered this document from the Yen Royal Archive in the 3rd week of the campaign. It should have been in the sealed section of the records annex, not in general circulation. "Where did you learn to read old Yen military script?" The pause. Controlled. "My father taught me." Urin looked at him. The brazier was low, the light warm and limited, and in it Luo's face was composed in the particular way of a man who has rehearsed composure until it became structural. The kind of stillness that was not natural, the kind that had been built, deliberately over a long time. Urin was very good at recognizing things that were built deliberately. He was one of them. "Don't read things that aren't assigned to you," he said. He did not confiscate the scroll. He put it back on the records table and went to the far side of his tent and did not look at Luo again that night. He did not need to. He had the image already. The posture, the hands, the way the man had closed the scroll with the careful expertise of someone who had spent years around documents that mattered. His father taught him. In old Yen military script. In the border provinces. Urin lay on his sleeping mat and looked at the ceiling of his tent and did not sleep for a long time. The Dignity Test, Week 4. Commander by Swan was the kind of officer who required, at regular intervals, to be reminded that he had authority. He was competent enough. Urin would not have promoted a man who wasn't, but competence had not quieted the particular hunger in him that made him, periodically, need to see other people bend. He arrived at the command tent on a morning when Urin was at the field inspection, and he conducted what he called a readiness check on the camp workers. It was not a readiness check. It was a man walking slowly down a line of kneeling people and watching them hold very still. Every slave in the line complied immediately. They had learned, as people in their position learned, that the fastest way through a moment like this was total submission. Eyes down. Hands flat on thighs. Breathing steady. Luo knelt. His spine stayed straight. It was a small thing. It was not defiance. His eyes were down, his hands were correctly placed, he made no sound. But the geometry of him was wrong. He knelt the way a man kneels when he has chosen to kneel, not the way a man kneels when he has no other option. Swan stopped in front of him. He crouched down to look at him directly, a posture that was meant to feel like a gift. "I am lowering myself to your level," but functioned as a frame, making it clear that the lowering was temporary and chosen. "You're the general's record slave." "Yes, Commander." "You think being his property makes you special?" "No, Commander." "Then why," Swan said softly, "do you kneel like a man who expects to stand back up?" Luo said nothing. He held the silence with the patience of someone who had held worse silences in worse rooms, and he did not move, and he did not apologize, and he did not collapse. Swan held the crouch for a long moment. Then he stood and moved on. When he was gone, Luo rose. His hands were steady. He straightened his robe and returned to the records table and picked up the correspondence he had been sorting before the interruption. Across the tent, the elderly man assigned to linen folding watched him rise. He was perhaps 60, with the careful economy of movement of someone managing old injuries. He had been in the camp for 3 weeks, brought in with the last batch of civilian labor from the Yen border clearances. He looked at Luo. Luo looked at him. In the fraction of a second between those two looks, something crossed both their faces. Not words. Not a signal. The specific grief of two people who had once lived in the same world and were now here, in this tent, in these robes, folding linen and sorting correspondence for the army that had ended that world. Neither of them spoke of it. There was nothing to speak of. The speaking would have made it real in a way it was more survivable to keep quiet. Chapter 2, What Starts in Silence. The Developing Habit, Weeks 5 through 8. Yurin developed habits he did not name. He returned to his tent earlier than his schedule required. He was capable of reading reports in silence but found himself requesting evening briefings spoken aloud, not because the information required it but because he had noticed, somewhere around the end of the third week, that Luo's voice when he was reading correspondence was different from his voice at other times. More present, less careful. The accent he maintained slipped slightly at the edges when he was concentrated, and what replaced it was Northern. Old Northern. The cadence of a class of education that no longer existed in this part of the world. He corrected Luo's pronunciation of military rank titles twice, in the first week. Luo absorbed the corrections with the focused attention of a scholar encountering new information. No resentment, no performance of gratitude, just immediate integration and movement forward. Yurin found this more interesting than he had any reason to. He asked once where Luo was from. The border provinces, he was told. The eastern settlements. Yurin said nothing. The eastern settlements had not produced that accent in living memory, if they ever had. But he did not pursue it. He had made a decision, somewhere in the second week, to not look at the thing he was looking at. It was not a decision he had made consciously. It was more that he had noticed himself making it and had not corrected it, which was the same thing. The first heat, week 6. A supply delay in the 6th week left the camp's medical stores short for 5 days. Physician Ruam managed the shortage with characteristic efficiency, prioritizing battlefield treatment supplies, rationalizing distribution, sending an emergency requisition south. She did not notice, until the 3rd day, that the suppression herb allocation for the camp's Omega status personnel was also affected. By the time she noticed, Luo had been managing without it for 4 days. He did not report this. He did not go to the physician's tent. He barricaded himself in the records annex with the filing backlog and worked through it with methodical, deliberate focus, because focus was what he had and he used what he had. His hands shook at the edges of tasks. He did not stop the tasks. Yurin found him at the 3rd hour of the night. A missing correspondence file, the Zhao family military alliance documentation needed for a morning briefing, brought him to the records annex when he would otherwise have been at his desk. He pushed the canvas flap open and stopped. The scent hit him before the image registered. Omega in distress. That was the first layer, the one any alpha would have caught. But underneath it, something else. Something complex and low and resonant, like a chord struck on an instrument he had never heard before and somehow already knew. His chest tightened. His instincts, usually subordinated entirely to his command brain, surfaced without permission. Luo looked up from the file he was holding. His face was composed. His eyes were fever-bright. The Zhao correspondence is in the 3rd cabinet, he said. Left side. Last month's seal. Yurin did not move toward the cabinet. When did you last take suppression herbs? The current dosage is sufficient, General. That's not what I asked. Silence. Luo held the file he was working on and looked at him and did not answer. Yurin turned and left the annex. He returned 20 minutes later with a full clinical dispensation from Physician Rua, the grade reserved for high-priority personnel, which Luo was not, technically, but which Yurin had listed him as without explanation and which Rua had filled without asking questions because she was a physician who understood that generals sometimes did things that weren't explained. He left it outside the annex flap without knocking. He took the Zhao correspondence to his desk and briefed himself. In the morning there was a small addition to the Zhao file on his desk, a margin annotation in Luo's handwriting, noting a date discrepancy in the original alliance record that would have, if uncorrected, caused a supply misallocation problem in approximately 2 weeks. Yurin read it 3 times. Then he sat down and looked at the wall of his tent for a moment, and something in his chest performed a function he did not have good language for, and he set it aside and went to the morning briefing. The ruins, wiki. The fortress ruins were visible on clear nights from the rear edge of the command tent, the eastern Yen border fortifications, stone silhouettes against the dark, the skeleton of a military infrastructure that had taken 3 generations to build and 6 weeks to end. Yuren noticed that Luo looked at them every night. He noticed this the way he noticed most things. Catalogued it, filed it, did not speak of it. On the 8th night of the 8th week he could not sleep. This was not unusual. He frequently could not sleep. His mind ran its tactical assessments on a cycle that didn't recognize darkness as a reason to stop. He got up, dressed, walked to the rear edge of the tent. Luo was there. This was also not unusual, Yuren realized. Every time he had come to the tent's rear edge unable to sleep, for times in the past 2 weeks, Luo had been there. He had not thought about this pattern until now. He sat beside him. Not close. General's distance. The 2 feet of space that communicated nothing personal. For a time neither of them said anything. The camp was quiet around them. The fires were low. The ruins were where they always were. You look at those every night, Yuren said. You've noticed. I notice most things. The pause. Luo's eyes were on the horizon. Were they burning when you arrived? The fortresses. Yuren was quiet for a moment. The eastern too. The western garrison had already fallen. Did many people escape? Some. The civilian evacuation corridors were honored throughout the campaign. The beat. That was my order, Yuren said. The emperor wanted full military closure. I disagreed. Luo turned to look at him. A slow turn. Careful. Why? Because a kingdom's civilians are not its king's crimes. The campaign was necessary. The execution of it was mine to control. Something crossed Luo's face. Something complicated that passed quickly. You burned a great deal, he said. Despite your orders. Yes. Yuren held his gaze. I burned a great deal. The silence between them was a different quality now. Not comfortable. It had never been comfortable. There was too much architecture in this tent for comfort, but honest. The first honest silence they had shared. The eastern fortress had a library, Luo said. His voice was level. 300 years of accumulated manuscript. The Yen Royal Astronomical Records. The first written account of enigma cultivation in the northern provinces. Yuren did not respond. They didn't make it out. No. Do you think about that? A long pause. The longest Yuren had allowed in any conversation in recent memory. Yes, he said. Luo looked back at the ruins. His profile was grief-shaped, the way some faces were, not actively grieving, but carved by it, the way stone is shaped by water over a long time. They sat together in the dark for a while longer. The fortress ruins did what ruins do, which is to exist without commentary, without resolution, making the darkness around them look deeper by contrast. When Luo finally rose to go back inside, Yuren did not stop him. He sat there for another few minutes alone, looking at the horizon, and thought about the order he had given for the evacuation corridors, and about 300 years of astronomical records, and about the way a man could carry grief in his posture for 2 years and still hold his spine straight through it. Chapter 3. The Weight of It. The Bond Forms, Weeks 9 through 12. Yuren began eating his evening meal later. He told himself, the first 3 times, that it was because the administrative backlog required extended evening attention. By the 4th time he had stopped telling himself anything and simply adjusted his schedule without annotation. The result was that his meal coincided with the hour when Luo finished the day's correspondence and began the filing review. They ate in the same room without eating together, Yuren at his desk, Luo at the records table. They did not speak during this hour. They did not need to. The presence had become something both of them moved around without discussing, the way people move around furniture they have stopped noticing. Yuren noticed anyway. He noticed everything. He simply stopped acting on it. Luo, for his part, had begun to understand Xiao Yuren the way a cartographer understands difficult terrain, not with affection but with precision, with respect for the reality of it. This was a man who had spent 34 years being exactly what the emperor's military required. There was no room in that architecture for softness, for ambiguity, for the kind of warmth that a person builds when they have been permitted to want things. He had not been permitted to want things. He had wanted them anyway, privately, and had built walls around the wantings so thick and so exact that even he sometimes forgot what was behind them. Luo had spent his childhood studying human beings as a prince studies them, not with emotion but with analysis. He read Yuren with the same careful attention, and what he found was not what he had expected to find in the man who had commanded the campaign that ended his world. What he found was someone trying very hard to be adequate to something he had never been taught to name. He didn't know what to do with this. So he filed it the way he filed most things and continued working. The hidden competence, weeks 10 through 12. He reorganized the army's entire supply chain correspondence structure in 4 days, working in the gaps between assigned tasks. He did not announce this. He simply did it, leaving the improved system in place and returning the previous materials to an archive folder labeled prior format, in case there was a reason for the original structure he hadn't identified. There wasn't. The supply chain delays dropped by 1/3 over the following week. The quartermaster assumed it was a staffing improvement. He identified a flaw in the Northern Patrol rotation that would have left a 2-hour surveillance gap in the border's most vulnerable quadrant every 6 days. He notated this on the relevant scheduling file in his usual and signed script. Yuren corrected the rotation the same afternoon. On the 12th evening, Yuren looked up from his desk to find Luo at the records table with a stack of Yen-language military archive documents, recovered from the campaign, not yet fully translated, working through them with the speed of someone reading their own history. "The patrol correction," Yuren said. "That was yours. The schedules were in the files I manage." "That's not an answer." The pause. Luo set down the document he was reading. "Yes. It was mine. You have military training. I have an education." "From where?" The pause lasted 4 seconds. Yuren counted them as he counted most things. "Somewhere that no longer exists," Luo said. Yuren looked at him for a long moment. The oil lamp was low between them, the light warm, and in it Luo's face was very composed and very still and held, underneath that stillness, the particular depth of a person who is carrying something heavy enough that they have long since stopped expecting anyone else to notice it. Yuren noticed it. He looked at his desk. Then he pushed half his evening meal across the table. He said nothing. No explanation, no softness, no performance. He pushed the bowl across and looked back at his documents. Luo looked at the bowl. Then at the general's profile, focused on paperwork with the precision of a man who had made a decision and was not going to examine it. He pulled the bowl toward him and ate. The seal cracks, week 11. A border skirmish broke the camp perimeter at the eastern edge on a Thursday morning, brief and sharp. A raiding party testing the Army's response time ended in 11 minutes by mean phase rapid deployment. In the records tent, Luo heard it and continued working. He had survived 2 years in proximity to military violence by learning to assess threat level from sound alone, and what he heard was a contained incursion, not a collapse. What he did not account for was the panicked recruit. The young soldier came through the wrong tent in his retreat, stumbling backward from the skirmish line, disoriented, hitting the canvas wall of the records tent hard enough to loosen the support ropes. The main shelving cabinet, heavy oak, full of bound correspondence volumes, lurched forward. Luo moved. His hand came up. The cabinet stopped. Not because he caught it. His arm was not braced against it, his body was not positioned to take the weight. The cabinet simply arrested. For a fraction of a second, a full breath, it hung in the air at a 30-degree angle with no physical support to account for its stillness. Then the seal reasserted itself and the weight returned and Luo redirected it with both arms into a controlled fall against the far wall, away from the correspondence, away from the recruit, damaging nothing. The recruit scrambled out. The skirmish ended. No one saw. Luo sat on the floor of the records tent with his hand pressed flat against his own chest. His heartbeat was wild. The seal shifted. Just a fraction. Just a hairline crack in 2 years of imperial suppression. But a crack was a crack. He knew what it meant. A sealed enigma's resonance, once it began to re-emerge, bled outward slowly, like heat from a covered fire. Invisible at first. Detectable to those trained to detect it, within weeks. He had weeks. Perhaps less. He returned to the correspondence. His hands were steady. He did not decide anything. He had learned, across a long 2 years, that decisions made in crisis states were rarely the right ones, and that the most important thing a person could do when facing an impossible situation was to continue doing the immediate task until the shape of the possible became clearer. The immediate task was the correspondence. He did the correspondence. The night it changes, week 12. The nightmare was always the Eastern Fortress. Not the battle itself. The battle was clean in the way battles were, all forward motion and tactical calculation, no space for anything that wasn't objective-based. The nightmare was always the silence after. The particular quality of quiet that fell over a place when the thing that had made it alive was gone. Urin woke from it at the second hour of the night and found himself at the tent entrance without remembering walking there. This happened sometimes. His body navigated to open spaces when the tent felt too heavy. Luo was awake. He was always awake at the second hour of the night when Urin woke from the nightmare, which was a pattern Urin had noticed and never examined. "Sit," Luo said. It was said the way one might say it to a person who had been standing too long. Not a command. An observation with a logical conclusion attached. Urin, who had never been told to sit in his own tent, sat. Luo made tea. The yen preparation. He had been making it without comment for 6 weeks now, the particular combination that Urin had not asked about and had not stopped either. He set the cup in front of the general and stood at the tent's side, looking out at the dark camp. The Eastern Fortress had a library, he said. Urin went very still. I told you that once before. Yes. There were also records. Not military. Personal. The Yen royal family kept personal chronicles going back 11 generations. Bers. Des. The small things. Who was afraid of storms? Who couldn't sleep? What a particular princess said on the day the Northern Treaty was signed. His voice was perfectly even. The evenness was the thing that made it worse, somehow. They didn't make it out either. No, Urin said. They didn't. A long silence. Lian. It came out before he had decided to say it. Not Luo. Not the slave. Not the name on the auction manifest. Lian. The silence that followed was of a different quality than all the silences before it. Luo Tian turned from the tent's edge slowly. He looked at the general with an expression that was very composed and, underneath the composure, very old. How long, he said. The vowels. The posture. The way you read old Yen military script. Not like a student. Like a man reviewing documents he wrote. Urin held his teacup. The Crown Prince of Yen was not seen in public after age 14. I did not know your face. But I knew what I was looking at. And yet you said nothing. No. Why? The question sat between them. Urin looked at his tea. At the hands wrapped around it. A general's hands, calloused, precise, the hands that had signed the orders. He did not look at them often. Because it stopped mattering, he said. What you were before. It stopped mattering before I had decided to stop looking at you. This was, for Xiao Yuran, the longest speech he had ever made about something that was not tactical. Lian looked at him for a long time. The grief was in his face. It was always in his face. It had been there since the first day. The grief was structural. But underneath it, something else. Something that had been building in the exact careful space between a general who did not look away and a prince who had stopped expecting to be seen. The library burned, Lian said. You should know that. Whatever you decide to feel, the library burned. Yes, Urin said. I know. Can you live with that? The pause. The longest one yet. I'm trying, Urin said. They sat together in the dark. The camp was quiet. The fortress ruins were on the horizon. When Lian reached across the space between them, not for the tea, not toward anything specific, just to set his hand on the surface beside Urin's, it was the most sovereign gesture he had made in 2 years. Urin covered it with his own. Carefully. Without performance. They held that for a while. Outside, the northern wind moved through the camp, the fire guttered, the ruins held their silence, and neither of the men in the tent said anything else that night. They did not need to. The saying had already happened. What follows? Week 12. It does not happen all at once. That is the first thing. There is no single moment when one man reaches for the other across a cleared space and everything is simple after that. It is not simple. It is two people who have spent their entire lives learning to be alone in rooms that require performance, discovering that the performance has stopped working. Yuren does not know how to be gentle. This is not a character flaw. It is a gap in his architecture, the same gap that exists in everything he built himself into. Precision, yes. Discipline, yes. The specific care of a commander who tracks his men's morale and supply needs and reads the terrain of human exhaustion with the same focus he brings to military terrain. But gentleness is a different skill. He applies himself to it with the same focus he applies to everything, which is almost the right approach and not quite. Lian notices this and does not correct him. He has spent 2 years learning to be invisible, and this is the opposite of invisible. This is the specific quality of being looked at by someone who is paying attention with their whole self. It undoes him in ways he was not prepared for. He had expected, if it ever came to this, to feel the grief more loudly. Instead, what he feels is both things simultaneously, the grief present, structural, unavoidable, and underneath it something warm and specific and directed, the particular warmth of a person finding, in an unlikely place, that they are known. He does not disappear inside this. Neither does Yuren. They find each other across the gap slowly, with the focused attention of two people who have been watching each other for weeks and finally allow themselves to. It is awkward in some moments. It is very exact in others. By the end of it, the tent is quiet and the lamp is low, and Lian is looking at the ceiling with his arm against Yuren's side, and the ruins are still on the horizon, and both things, the grief and the warmth, are equally present. Yuren holds both. This is, in the end, what he is actually good at. Not gentleness. Holding. Chapter 4. The Pregnancy. The Discovery, Week 14. He had been ignoring the signs. This was not denial, precisely. He did not have the framework for denial because he did not have the framework for what was happening. Nausea was stress. Fatigue was overwork. The shift in his scent that physician Rua registered when he walked past her tent was a seasonal adjustment. He was a general. His body did not produce symptoms he could not explain. Rua examined him at his request for what he believed was a persistent digestive complaint. She was a thorough physician. She was also a physician who had read every available text on enigma-adjacent biological phenomena, because knowledge was how she managed living in proximity to 100,000 armed men. The examination was thorough. The silence afterward was long. Then she said, with the careful tone of someone delivering news to a person who controlled her salary and also the largest independent military force in the empire, "General Xiao, you are approximately 7 weeks along." Yuren sat with this. He sat with it for a considerable time. "That is not possible," he said. His voice was completely level. "It is extraordinarily rare," Rua said. In an alpha with sufficient spiritual resonance, sustained proximity to an omega of enigma-adjacent lineage can trigger what the old texts call a resonance carrier event. The records go back 300 years. There are perhaps 12 documented cases. Yuren said nothing. "The last confirmed case," she continued, with the precision of a woman who had been preparing this speech from the moment the examination revealed what it revealed, was a Yen northern general in the year of the Copper Dragon. "The records are from the archive, the pre-campaign archive. I found them in the recovered Yen documents." He looked at her. "The child," she said carefully, "will carry both lineages. Whatever the Omega's origin contains, spiritually, bloodline-wise, will be present in the child alongside your own." Yuren stood up. He walked to the entrance of the physician's tent and looked out at the camp. His army, his 100,000 soldiers going about the precise machinery of military life in the cold northern morning. Who else knows? No one. Keep it that way. He went to find Lian. The confrontation. Lian received the news with the stillness of a man whose entire life had been shaped by information that destroyed things. He sat. He was quiet for a long time. He looked at Yuren's face, not furtively, directly, with the particular focus of a person taking a reading. "You're not angry," he said. "Should I be?" "Most alphas." "I'm not most alphas." Yuren sat across from him. Not at command distance. Close. Tell me what you want. This question undid Lian more than the news had. He looked away. His composure, held through 2 years of captivity and 1 campaign and 1 general who kept not looking away, cracked at the edges. I want my kingdom back, he said quietly. I want my father's library. I want the people who were scattered across 3 provinces as slaves to have a home. The pause. I cannot have any of those things. No, Yuren agreed. He did not offer comfort. Comfort was not what was needed. What do you want that you can have? Lian looked at him. At this man who had burned his home and also kept his secret and also pushed a meal across a table in the dark and also was, apparently, carrying his child. He looked at him the way he had looked at the ruins, with grief and with something that lived alongside the grief. I don't know yet, he said honestly. Then we'll find out, Yuren said. Together. The seal breaks, weeks 15 through 16. The pregnancy accelerated what the cabinet incident had begun. By the 15th week, Lian's cultivation resonance was bleeding outward at a level he could feel in his own body. A persistent warmth along his meridians, the return of a sensitivity he had not had in 2 years, the enigma sight that had been sealed resolving back into focus like a fog lifting. He could not stop it. He had tried. The seal had been designed for a man at rest, not for a man whose body was engaged in the particular biological intensity of an enigma pregnancy. The child was demanding things from him that the seal could not prevent. Ruo detected it first, a quality in his presence that she noted clinically and mentioned to Yuren in a careful, low-voiced briefing. Then Minfei, whose enigma sensitivity was minimal but not absent, began to experience the slight resonance awareness that came from proximity to emerging cultivation. And in the imperial capital, 600 li to the south, one of Emperor Tsongwuha's court mages sat up from meditation and said to the colleague beside him, in a very even voice, "The Yen Enigma is alive." Chapter 5, Betrayal and Consequence. Swan moves, week 16. Commander Bai Swan had been feeding the emperor's court for 8 months. This was not hatred. He had nothing against Xiao Yuren. He respected him, in the way that ambitious men respect the people occupying the positions they want, which is to say thoroughly and without sentiment. The Northern Iron Army was the most powerful independent military force in the empire. Command of it was the single most valuable position a soldier could hold. Swan had been patient. He had been useful. He had built, quietly, a relationship with the emperor's intelligence apparatus that was now worth more than everything else he had. When the pregnancy became known to him, through a supply clerk who had overheard something outside the physician's tent and come to Swan because Swan paid for things like that, he understood immediately what he was holding. Not just leverage. Resolution. He sent everything in a single courier dispatch. The pregnancy, Lian's identity, the enigma seal's deterioration, the full intelligence picture assembled from 8 months of careful observation. He included physician Rua's examination notes, which he had obtained by having her tent searched while she slept. He waited. Minfei, week 16, 3 days later. Su Minfei had suspected Swan for 6 weeks. She had no proof until she found the courier route, a modified supply cart that bypassed the standard checkpoint, operated by a driver who had been on Swan's personal staff for 3 years. She had the driver followed for 4 days before she had enough. She came to Yuren at the 7th hour of the night with the evidence in her hands and her face holding the careful neutrality of a soldier reporting something she wished she wasn't reporting. Yuren read the documentation. He set it down. He looked at the wall. How long? 8 months minimum. Possibly longer. What has the emperor received? Everything, sir. The pregnancy. Lian's identity. The seal. All of it. A long pause. And the response. She set the second document on the table. An imperial dispatch intercepted from Swan's private correspondence, already received, already read, already responded to. Yuren read it once. 50,000 soldiers from the southern imperial garrison. Already mobilized. Marching north under direct imperial seal. The order was precise. The slave Luo and the general's unborn child were to be brought to the capital for imperial review. General Xiao Yuren was to be relieved of command pending investigation. Any resistance was to be classified as treason. Yuren set the paper down. When do they arrive? 12 days given current march pace. And Swan? In his quarters. Unaware that we know. Yuren stood. He reached for his armor. It was the middle of the night. Wake my senior officers, he said. All of them. Not Swan. Annex, the same night. He had heard enough through the tent wall. Not all of it. Enough. He sat for a moment with what he had heard and he thought, not panicked, not reactive, but with the precise layered thinking that had been drilled into him across a childhood of political education. What could be saved? What could not? What the next move was? There was something he knew about Swan that no one else knew, because no one else had read 4 months of his personal correspondence. He went to Swan's tent alone. It was not a brave decision. It was a strategic one, the only move available that could buy time without requiring Yuren to commit to a position he couldn't take back. Once Yuren moved against the Emperor openly, the line was crossed. Lian wanted to see if the line could be delayed. He pushed the tent flap open and went inside. Swan was at his desk. He looked up with the expression of a man who had not expected a visitor at this hour and had several reasons for that to be a problem. Then the air in the tent changed. It was not dramatic. It was not a display. It was simply the seal releasing, not a flood, a controlled aperture, the enigma cultivation of a trained royal re-emerging after 2 years of suppression. The quality of the air shifted. The lamp flames steadied unnaturally. The resonance that Minfei had been feeling for weeks became, in this small space, unmistakable. Swan went very still. You sent everything, Lian said. He sat down across from the man without being invited. The pregnancy. My name. You gave them all of it. You're a... Don't, Lian said. Quietly. We both know what I am. Let's use the time productively. Swan's hand moved toward the blade at his side. You don't want to do that, Lian said. Not a threat. A simple statement of fact. The enigma resonance in the tent was sufficient, at this proximity, to make a direct physical action an uncomfortable proposition. The hand stopped. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to offer you a choice. I don't take offers from slaves. You sent intelligence to the Emperor that will result in 50,000 soldiers marching on the army you serve in. Lian held his gaze. You have a son. 14 years old. He's in the household of the Wen family in the capital. You've been paying the debt that keeps him there for 6 years. I know this because I've read your correspondence. Silence. When the Emperor arrives here with 50,000 men and finds out that his intelligence source was operating in a command tent with a re-emerged Yen enigma for 4 months and failed to report the full picture earlier, Lian said carefully, the question of what happens to your son becomes a question of what the Emperor needs to make an example of. Swan's face had changed. What I'm offering is this: send a correction dispatch. Tonight. Report that the slave has been identified as a false lead, that the enigma resonance was environmental interference, not a person. By Yuren's army 12 days to move to a defensible position. The pause. In exchange, I will ensure your son is moved from the Wen household to a location the Emperor cannot use as leverage. I have the means to do this. I am choosing to use them for you. You can't guarantee that. I am the disgraced crown prince of a destroyed kingdom, carrying the child of your commanding general, with a fully re-emerged enigma seal in a sealed camp. Lian held his eyes. I am the single most politically inconvenient person in the empire right now. If I choose to make your son's safety my priority, it will be my priority. That's what I'm offering. It's the only offer you'll receive tonight. The silence lasted a long time. Then Swan reached for paper and ink. The consequence? The enigma release cost more than he had calculated. Sustained cultivation after 2 years of suppression, while carrying at the level required to hold Swan's compliance long enough for the dispatch to be prepared and sealed, his body registered the cost incrementally and he held through it, because it was not finished yet, and he was not yet permitted to stop. He made it out of the tent and across the camp and almost to the records annex. Yuren found him on the ground outside the canvas flap. Conscious. Unable to stand. His meridians were depleted in a way that felt like every road had been walked simultaneously and left without repair. The enigma site, briefly fully open, had closed back down to a narrow thread. He looked up at Yuren from the ground and said, with the composed voice of a man reporting a completed task, "Swan's correction dispatch is on its way. You have 12 days. Yuren crouched. He looked at him for a moment, this man on the ground in the cold northern dark, who had gone alone to the tent of the person who had betrayed them and had come back with 12 days. He picked him up. Not helped him up. Picked him up, one arm under his knees, one at his back, and carried him inside without comment. Physician Rua was summoned. The child was unharmed. Lian was severely depleted, his spiritual and physical reserves both running dangerously low, and required at minimum 2 weeks of rest and careful recovery. Yuren sat beside him for the rest of the night. He did not sleep. He held his hand. He did not speak. In the morning, Swan's correction dispatch was already 3 hours on the road south. Chapter 6, The Reckoning. He laid it out with the same precision he brought to a battle briefing. Of it. The slave's identity. His own pregnancy. The child's lineage. Swan's operation. The Emperor's dispatch. The 12 days. He spoke for 11 minutes. He answered no questions during the 11 minutes. When he finished, he stood in front of his assembled senior officers, 9 men and 2 women who had followed him across 3 campaigns, and he said, "You are free to return to Imperial Command. All of you, without exception. You have served this army with distinction. I will not ask any of you to commit treason for my personal life." He turned to leave. "Sir." From the back of the tent. He stopped. "You ordered civilian evacuation corridors in the Yen campaign," she said. Her voice was even. Factual. When the Emperor wanted full closure. There are families across the northern border settlements, Yen families, who made it out because of that order. There are children alive because of that order. There are slaves in this camp right now who weren't executed because of that order. The tent was silent. "That's not what a general looks like when he treats people as acceptable losses," Minfei said. "That's not a man I hand to the Emperor because it's convenient." She put her fist to her chest. One by one, in the silence that followed, every officer in the tent did the same. Yuren stood with his back to them for a moment longer. Then he turned. His face was controlled. Something in it was not entirely controlled. He did not address this. "We move north," he said, "to the Yen border territories. We establish a defensible position in the ruins of the old northern garrison and we negotiate from strength. The Emperor will send diplomats before he sends another army. He cannot afford the optics of moving against his own northern command without cause." His voice was the voice of a general. Precise. Absolute. The voice that had moved 100,000 men across 3 campaigns. "We will be ready for both," he said. "Diplomats and army. Move out in 6 hours." Conversation. That night. He told Lian what he had done while Lian was propped against the tent support with a cup of Rua's prescribed recovery tea and the particular focused stillness of someone listening to information that changes things. When Yuren finished, Lian was quiet for a moment. "You've defected. I've repositioned. To the ruins of my kingdom. To the north border. Which I intend to hold." Lian looked at him. A long look, the reading look, the cartographer's look. "You're going to try to rebuild it." "I'm going to try to build something," Yuren said carefully. "What it is depends on what you want." "You burned it." "Yes. And now you're—" "I'm not offering to fix it," Yuren said. "I can't fix it. The library is gone. The records are gone. The 11 generations of personal chronicles are gone. I can't give those back." He moved closer, crouched to his level. "Eye to eye. I'm telling you that whatever I can give you from this point forward, I will give it. The army. The North. The acknowledgement, formal, public, documented, that this child's lineage is Yen as much as it is mine. That he is the crown prince of something as much as he is a general's heir." The silence was enormous. Lian pressed his hand to his face. His shoulders moved once. Just once. The grief that had been structural for 2 years finding, in this specific moment, a crack in the architecture wide enough to pass through. Then the composure reasserted itself. He lowered his hand. His eyes were wet. His face was steady. "The library," he said. "What about it?" "There were copies. The astronomical records. I had copies made and sent to 3 northern monasteries before the campaign arrived. I didn't know if they survived." Yuren was quiet. "I would like to know if they survived," Lien said. "Then we'll find out," Yuren said. He said it the same way he had said everything else across this night, as a simple statement of what would now happen, because he had decided it would happen, which was the only way he had ever known how to make things true. "Yes," Lien said quietly. "We will." Epilogue. 6 months later. The north border had 2 desks now. This was the most visible change in the command tent, and also the least important one. The important changes were harder to see, the particular quality of the mornings now, Yuren's schedule adjusted by 40 minutes without explanation, the tea preparation that had been standard in the tent for months and had simply remained standard. Luo's old sleeping pallet in the records annex was used for storage. This had happened gradually, without announcement. The negotiations had taken 11 weeks. Emperor Tsongwuha was not gracious about any of it. He was, however, pragmatic. He had not maintained his empire through 3 decades of complex political terrain by being ungracious when race was expensive. An army of 100,000 on Yen land, with a re-emerged enigma in its command structure, and the political optics of moving against a pregnant general who had ordered civilian evacuation corridors, was expensive. The north border was formally designated a special military district under General Zhao's autonomous command. The child's Yen lineage was recognized in a document the emperor signed with the expression of a man performing an act he found distasteful and intended to revisit at a later date. This was not justice. Lien understood the difference. He had understood the difference between what was possible and what was right for long enough that he had stopped being surprised by the gap between them. What mattered now was what was possible, and what was possible was this: the north and the desk beside Yuren's, and the 3 manuscripts recovered from the northern monasteries and currently on a low shelf on his side of the tent. Yuren had sent the soldiers himself. A small unit, dispatched with the same precise orders he brought to everything: find the manuscripts, treat them as military intelligence, bring them back undamaged. He did not understand why they mattered as much as they did. He did not need to understand. He sent the soldiers. The child arrived in the 9th month. A boy. Already resonant. Ruan noted it within the first hour, the particular spiritual quality of a child who had absorbed both lineages in the womb and was carrying them with the apparent ease of someone to whom this was simply how the world was. He had Yuren's jaw. He had Lian's eyes. He had a stillness that belonged to both of them and to neither of them, and that made everyone who held him feel, inexplicably, that they were in the presence of something that was going to matter. Lian held him first. He looked at his face for a long time. Yuren stood at the tent's edge, giving him the space that felt right to give, watching him the way he watched most things, with precise, unperforming attention. "He needs a name from both," Lian said. "Yes. Something that doesn't erase either." "Yes." Lian looked up at him. The grief in his face was still there. It would always be there. This was not a story that resolved grief, only a story about what grief could coexist with, what it could be carried alongside. What it coexisted with now was the warmth of the tent, and the weight of the child, and the general standing 3 feet away who had burned his home and had sent soldiers for 3 manuscripts and had spent 11 weeks negotiating the existence of something that had never been supposed to happen. Lian did not have a name for this yet. He was learning to inhabit it. "Xiao Yuren," he said. "You are the most inconvenient thing that has ever happened to me." Yuren crossed the tent, sat beside him, looked at his son. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted, that fraction of movement that on anyone else would have been a smile. "Likewise," he said. Outside, Min Fei was running the morning formation with her characteristic ferocity. The 100,000 moved in the cold border air, their breath visible, the camp alive with its usual precision. On the shelf, 3 manuscripts. Astronomical records. Not all of them. So, on the horizon, the ruins of the eastern fortresses. Still there. Still visible on clear mornings. The library burned. The copies survived. Both things were true. Hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.